AI touches almost every stage of my work as a product designer now, and I've optimized so much over the last few months that now, surprisingly, generating UI is the least interesting part. I use AI to keep track of context across projects, to get through large research studies, to pressure test product decisions, to prototype ideas, to document, to hand off designs to engineers. And this part makes me very excited to work inside the code base itself. So today, instead of giving you a list of AI tools, I want to show you the actual problems I use AI to solve, the tools I use for each problem, and where my own judgment still comes in. Hi, I'm Alison, and I'm a senior product designer who is focused on user experiences, and a lot of my recent work also crosses into design engineering, right? I've been designing digital products for over 6 years across fintech, consumer products, and now creative AI tools. And over the past year especially, I've spent a ridiculous amount of time experimenting with how AI can actually make me better at the work that I do and help me spend more of my time on the parts that require actual thinking. I also build my own products and ideas, which has also pushed me further into prototyping and code. And that has changed the way that I think about what my role as a designer can actually look like. So I thought I would take one step back and show you the full system. Starting with probably one of the least glamorous but severe problems in my workflow, and I'm sure that we all experience this, I think. Number one is context. My work as a product designer revolves around a ridiculous amount of context. And I think this applies to a lot of jobs as well because there's a lot of inputs and moving parts, especially when it comes to cross-functional collaboration. On any normal week, I might have a conversation with a product manager or a director, and then maybe I'm having a research session, and then a design review, and then a conversation with engineering, and then I move into maybe another project, and then multiple design requests. And then maybe 3 days later, I'm trying to remember why we made a particular decision. And suddenly, I have to reconstruct an entire chain of context just to answer one question. For me, constantly rebuilding that context became one of the biggest sources of friction in my work, to be honest, especially because I use multiple AI tools and I had to upload context every time I had to use a new tool, and it was just so frustrating. So I built a system around it. I call it Alison's operating system or Alison's chief of staff, and it's powered by Claude, but it's running on my device locally through my Mac terminal featuring Obsidian. I'm keeping the actual setup private right now because I love confidential information, but let me know if you want to see a step-by-step of how I built this. Meanwhile, I'm going to show you how it works. So I built a bunch of skills into the system, but my favorite and most effective one is check-in. I run this every morning and it pulls together context from things like my email, my Slack, my calendar for the day, and things that I was working on the previous day, right? It basically highlights things that are still open, any decisions that have already been made or not made, any low-hanging fruits that I need to resolve, any things that I need to follow up on. And I find this incredibly useful because I can focus on my work and I spend much less time asking myself, what happened in the meeting yesterday again? Oh, or what did we decide? Or what did we decide against? Or why did we decide that? The value here is really context retrieval, right? I already have the information, but Claude helps me get back to the useful part of it faster and in one place, and I can just focus on doing my work. And this becomes even more important when I move into research. Speaking of, the second way that I use AI is getting through a lot of research. Now, let's say that I run a usability study and I have 50 responses. Technically, I could sit down and watch all 50 sessions from beginning to end, but realistically, I also have designs to create, I have meetings to attend, I have feedback to respond to, and I have a product team waiting on answers. So I don't have the time to be doing all of that, which is why I use AI in layers. Now, I primarily use user testing for research, and it's technically not an AI tool on its own, but it has AI features that give me an initial summary of what happened across the study, right? So it surfaces the common themes, any recurring moments, or any patterns across the sessions, which gives me a very useful first pass and helps me figure out where I should start looking. But a lot of the time, the research that I'm doing at that point also connects to research that has already been done or another product or another team. And this is where I use NotebookLM. Especially when you work with a team of researchers, right? There can be so much existing research across different projects, different user groups, and different points in time. So someone might have looked at onboarding, for example, 6 months ago. Someone else might have interviewed the same type of users for a completely different project. And there might have already been research that answers part of the questions that I'm trying to, understand at the time that I'm doing my own research. So I can put those studies into NotebookLM to update the repository, and I ask questions across all the studies there. So think questions like, have you seen this behavior before? Or what have users said about this problem in previous studies? Or which past research is relevant to what we're seeing now? Or are there any findings from earlier studies that support or contradict what we're seeing today? And because NotebookLM gives me references back to the original sources, I can quickly see where that information came from or go back to the actual research. And I really like this because research can very easily become something you do once, put in a document somewhere and then everybody just moves on. But this makes it much easier to actually bring older research back into decisions we're making now. And then once I want to go deeper into the current study that I'm doing now, I'll usually move straight into Claude. If I have transcripts, for example, I can ask Claude to help me synthesize the full set. And this is where I get much more specific with the questions. So what behaviors appeared repeatedly? Or where did people hesitate? Or where did the participants disagree? Or which problems appeared across several sessions? Or are there any meaningful differences between different sets of users? Is there any participants who behave differently from everybody else? Or which sessions should I personally go back and watch closely? Now, that last question is particularly useful to me. Imagine 40 people complete a flow in roughly the same way, and then one person gets completely stuck. That one person could actually expose an edge case or an assumption in the experience that everybody else, happened to just move past. So I'm using the tools for slightly different things, right? User testing helps me get an initial view of the study. I use NotebookLM to help me connect what we are learning, to previous research and update the repository as well. And then Claude helps me to interrogate and synthesize the current research more deeply. And then I always go back to the actual sessions whenever something deserves more attention. AI helps me decide where to direct my attention, but the actual research judgment is still mine. Now, the third point that I use AI in my workflow is turning research into a product decision. Research gives you a lot of information, right? But the harder part is trying to figure out what any of it actually means for the product. And this is probably where I use Claude the most, right? Because I use it less like something that gives me answers and more like something that I can think through a problem with. For example, once I have research findings and I'm leaning towards a particular direction, I can give Claude the context and ask it to challenge me. I might say something like, oh, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's what we learned from research. Here's the direction I'm considering. What assumptions am I making? What have I missed? What evidence contradicts this direction? Or what would you challenge if I presented this in a product review? Now, sometimes most of the response is stuff I've already thought about, right? But every once in a while, it would ask one question that makes me stop and rethink something. And that is usually the value for me, right? I'm using it to pressure test my thinking before I take the work into a critic or speak to my PM or, any other stakeholder. I also use it a lot to solve for edge cases. So if I have designed the flow, I can ask, oh, what happens if this fails? Or what happens if, for a returning user, what happens if the person has already completed this step? Or what happens if they arrive here from somewhere else? Or what are the states that I might have missed? And then I decide which of those things are actually relevant to the product. We talk a lot about prompting when we talk about AI, and I do agree that prompting is useful, but I think the biggest skill is being able to look at the response and know what is useful, what is irrelevant, and what the right question to ask next is. Now, the fourth thing that I use AI for is working across a lot of information. Sometimes I'm working on something where the context is spread across a lot of different places. There might be research, notes, previous decisions, screenshots, previous Slack threads, documents, maybe even like files from different parts of the project. And this is usually when I reach out to Claude Cowork or sometimes Manus. Cloud Cowork is useful when I wanted to work across a set of files rather than me constantly copying and pasting everything in or uploading into a conversation, right? So I give it a folder with the relevant context and I ask it to help me walk through all of it. Now, maybe I have research findings or previous notes on a product brief. I can ask it to pull out the decisions that have already been made, identify any open questions, or help me prepare for the next stage of that work. And it's basically useful when the information I need already exists, right? But I need help bringing it together to make a more informed decision. But I use Manus slightly differently, right? I tend to reach for Manus when I want something a bit more agentic. Maybe I want to research something, organize it on information, or produce something that I can inspect rather than just have a conversation with me. You know what I mean? So I use both depending on what I'm trying to do. But I'm usually starting with the problem first, as you should be doing, and then figuring out which tool makes the most sense for it. I've also used Manus to build mini applications while I'm experimenting, and it's a bit expensive to be honest compared to other tools I've used, but it's really, really good. And then eventually, we get to the part that everyone expects from a product designer: visual design in Figma. Now, Figma is still where most of my actual design work happens, but the way that I get to the design has changed quite a bit. Sometimes I already know how roughly I want something to look like or feel like. I just need to see it and get a head start. So I will use Cloud Design to quickly turn the idea in my head into something visual. And I find this really useful because staring at a blank canvas and trying to imagine every possible direction does take a bit of time. But with Claude Design, I can immediately see the vision, share with my team and align on direction and, basically proceed accordingly. Now, I still design on the Figma canvas, don't get me wrong, because it still allows me to think more clearly about the experience and the overall user flow. Like, what happens when someone clicks this, or what happens when something fails, or, how does this behave across different states? And something that has made this workflow even more interesting recently is that the Figma MCP in Claude Code is bidirectional. So Claude and Figma can actually work in both directions, right? Claude can read the design context from my Figma file, so I can ask questions about what is already there, work through changes or use that context while I'm building. And I can also bring work back into Figma as editable layers. Talk about a sweet though. So instead of AI sitting somewhere outside of my design process, it starts to feel much closer to the actual workspace, right? Because I still make the design decisions. I still care about hierarchy, the interaction, the edge cases, those tiny details that make something feel good to use. I just spend less time getting there, which is pretty, really great. I also use Claude and Figma for things outside of product work, things like my social media assets, carousels, and so on. But I think that workflow deserves its own video because I use those tools quite differently there. Now, the sixth thing and most interesting thing right now that I use AI for is moving from design to code. Another part of my workflow that has changed quite a bit is how close I can now get to implementation. At work, I'm starting to work in more of a design engineering capacity. So sometimes instead of designing a prototype in Figma and handing it over to engineers, I can actually work on that prototype in code. And I use Cloud Code for a lot of this, right? I can go into the existing code base, understand how something currently works, make the changes that I need, test them, push an MR for my engineering team to review. My engineers still review everything before it goes anywhere near production, of course, but it just means that I can take an idea much further myself before handoff even happens. And I'm not trying to replace engineering. No, I think they're very important, but I really like being close to implementation because I get to see how the decisions that I am making actually behave in the product. But I probably use this even more when I'm building my own personal projects And Samak is a very good example. Now, Samak started as an idea that I had, and I had sketched out a few visuals. I played around with Claude design for the first iteration, and I had a rough idea of how I wanted the experience to work. So then I opened Codex and I started building. I worked with Codex to build the iOS version in Swift and Swift UI. And that process was very interesting, but also very iterative, right? It would build something, I would run it, use it, see what felt right or what needed change, go back to Codex, make the change, keep it moving. And eventually I had an actual application that I launched in the App Store. And shortly after the launch, I got a few people asking for an Android version. And this is where the speed actually really surprised me, because moving an app from iOS to Android, there's a lot more involved than translating between languages, right? Because Swift and Kotlin are two different platforms. The way that certain interactions work, they are different. So things like the widget, the navigation, sharing, the saving, all the features that we had on Samak, they have their own platform-specific implementations. But I already had a working product, so I went back into Codex. I gave it the existing iOS project, and I said, "Oh, recreate this experience for Android." And within minutes, I had the first version running. Obviously, the first version still needed work, right? Because I had to go through the app, test for the functionality, check the interactions, find issues, and make sure that the experience actually made sense on Android. But the fact that I could get to that first working version that quickly is probably the part that I value the most. It has changed the distance between having an idea and being able to execute on it, right? Before, I could only design the idea and hope for the best. Now I can design it, build it, use it, find the problems, and improve it while I'm still thinking through the product. And I think this has actually made me a better designer too, because implementation kind of forces you to answer questions that are easy to overlook when you are working on a Figma canvas, right? Things like, how does this actually behave, and what happens when data is missing, or what happens on a different screen size, or how should this interaction work differently on Android versus iOS, or what happens when something fails, or you know different things, and you think more cohesively about product experiences. And that's probably the biggest shift for me, because AI has given me a much shorter path between having an idea and actually seeing that idea work. And then there's handoff. And this is one part of my workflow that I have been experimenting with more recently, especially in Figma and since the launch of Figma agents. I found that it can actually generate annotations directly in the design, right? So once I have a flow, I simply ask it to fully annotate it for my engineering team using my design system as a guide, of course. And it covers things like the interactions, the component states, spacing, layout, behavior, and some of the details that an engineer would need when building. And I've actually been really impressed by how well it does this, right? A lot of that information, of course, already exists inside the Figma file, especially with the design system and components that we use. So instead of going through the entire flow and manually documenting every detail, right, I just let Figma agent do the first pass and then review what it has generated. Now, from the test that I've done so far, it has done a pretty decent job. I've had little to zero changes to make. And I also use it as a final pair of eyes on the design, right? I give it a flow and I ask it to look for any states I might have missed, check the copy for spellings and typographical errors, or just review the experience for anything that looks inconsistent before I hand it over. And that's pretty much how I use AI for handoff right now. Then there's communication, which probably takes up a lot more of a senior product designer's time than people realize. Giving feedback, explaining a decision, writing an update, preparing for a design review, responding to engineers, summarizing research. There's quite a lot of communication involved in the job. And for this, one of the tools that I use constantly is Wispr Flow. Now, I think much faster than I type, so being able to just speak and have that turned into text removes a lot of friction for me, right? So if I'm giving feedback on a design or writing an update, or I have a thought I want to capture while it's still fresh, I just speak, and sometimes that is enough. But when the thought needs a bit more structure, I'll take what I've said into Claude or ChatGPT and use that to clean it up, organize it or make it clearer. And I use this workflow a lot because it lets me spend more of my energy thinking about what I actually want to say rather than spending that energy trying to type perfectly. I know for some people, typing is not a big deal, but even if it's a few seconds of my time saved, I really, really appreciate it. So when I put everything together, my workflow looks less like a list of tools and more like a list of problems, right? I have a context problem, and Claude and my local setup help me retrieve it. I have too much research to get through, and user testing helps me get the first pass. NotebookLM helps me connect, current research with the work the team has already done, and Claude helps me synthesize this, research more deeply. I need to pressure test a product decision, and Claude becomes the thinking partner. I need to work across several files or pieces of context, and Claude Cowork or Manus comes in. I need to explore something visually, and then ChatGPT, Cloud Design, and Figma agents come in. I need to prototype and build something. I have Cloud Code or Codex. I need to prepare the work for engineering. I have Figma agent that helps me document it and review the workflow. And throughout all of this, Wispr Flow helps me communicate faster. Now, some of these tools appear more than once, and that is very intentional because I stopped thinking about my workflow as, oh, what does Claude do? Or what does NotebookLM do? Or what does Manus do? I'm usually asking, what problem am I solving? Am I trying to solve right now? And what is the best tool for that problem? And that's pretty much my AI workflow as a product designer. If there's any part of this that you want me to go deeper on, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.